Welcome to the Brainbox Podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Underwriting support for this episode of Brainbox is provided by The Springer Company, an Oklahoma company specializing in payroll and bookkeeping for small employers, nonprofits, and local government agencies. For more information, visit thespringercompany.com. In this episode, we'll be talking about the history of country music in Oklahoma. Our guest is Dr. Hugh Foley, a professor of fine arts at Rogers State University in Claremore, Oklahoma. Dr. Foley is also the program director of KUSH in Cushing, Oklahoma, where he's programmed Americana music since 1998. Dr. Foley is a 41-year veteran of commercial, educational, public, and military radio, and he's worked as a country DJ, country music syndicated producer, and alternative country DJ, as well as a country music programmer. At Rogers State, he's the faculty consultant to the college radio station, KRSC-FM, which features a weekly Americana specialty show he started called Backroads. Dr. Foley is a published music historian, an award-winning video documentary producer, and a founding board member of the Oklahoma Music Hall of Fame in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Dr. Foley was also the state scholar for Oklahoma Humanities' traveling Smithsonian exhibit called New Harmonies, which celebrated the history of American roots music. So, basically, there's no one better to talk about the history of Oklahoma country music than Dr. Hugh Foley, so we're so honored to have you on our show. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I want to meet that guy.
Yeah, it sounds like an awesome guy. I should mention we are live in Dr. Foley's amazing basement studio as well.
We call it the Rock House here.
It's incredible, yeah. So let's start out. Let's talk about what's a good definition of country music. What are some things that make an artist or a song country music?
Well, when we typically talk about country music, we mean that music that's descended from the British Isles. It's the fiddle music, the reels, and then the ballads that come with the immigrants from the British Isles to largely the American South. And once we get to that point, it's that music that filters out and diffuses from the American South west, and then the various subgenres that evolve from that. So when we talk about country music, we typically talk about it in 7 or 8 maybe subgenres. So we start, the first subgenre is old time, and that's that music that's the Carter family and the music that precedes the Carter family that is linked directly to the music of the British Isles.
Mm-hmm. What time period are we talking about there with the Carter family?
Well, I think, when music of the British Isles starts to make its way over here is the late 1700s, 1790s, early 1800s, that kind of thing. The Carter family is really the first family of country music. They're the first ones that are known as significant artists in that genre. And A.P. Carter went around the South collecting songs where there weren't any copyrights and then would record those songs. And so those songs go on to be quite popular, something like Keep on the Sunny Side or something along those lines. One of the melodies in a Carter family song becomes the melody for Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. A lot of these things are pointed out by the Ken Burns country music documentary that came out in 2019. So that old-time music is really the first place it begins. The little old cabin on the hill, the basic stringed instruments, the auto harp, the mandolin, the guitar as accompaniment, and that sort of thing. Subsequent to that, the music starts to move west, and that's where the singing cowboy tradition comes in, the popularity of that for so many different reasons. Gene Autry, who born in Texas but reared in Oklahoma, and after that, we see the rise of Western swing music, and that music that's influenced by jazz of the 1930s and is popularized by Bob Wills, largely out of the Cain's Ballroom in Tulsa, and merges Western sounds with the concepts of jazz, the swing beat, the swinging eights, or some version of that, and then adding, instead of having horns initially, having all the instrumentalists play the melody and then what we call swing out. They were jazz musicians. That's what they wanted to be thought of as distinguished from the mountain musicians, the Carter family, what ultimately evolves into bluegrass, which is really the next subgenre after Western swing is bluegrass, popularized by Bill Monroe, of course, and then ultimately Flatt and Scruggs and all the artists that came out of that region, which kind of shifted the focus of country music back to the South. Subsequent to that, we have another merging of styles that often gets called honky tonk, but really leads to what we know of as country and Western music. And so that
both kinds of music,
country and Western, which essentially Hank Williams Sr. embodies, because he's got that high nasal quality to his voice that comes out of the old time singing tradition, merged with the instruments of Western music, the amplified guitar, the steel guitar, and that sort of thing. So that's where we get that country and Western topic. Well, as a matter of fact, country and Western really comes about as a result of Billboard magazine wanting to get away from hillbilly music. You know, at the time, we typically called white music hillbilly music and black music race music in Billboard in the early 40s into the mid 50s. It wasn't really describing what was going on. So I think it's around 49, somewhere in that range, that Billboard creates an R&B chart and a folk parentheses country and Western chart. And so at that point, you know, the music kind of gets termed that. But honky tonk is really that music that rises out of the beer joints of Texas and Oklahoma, the oil fields, weekend music, party music, tear in your beer type music. It has a little harder edge because it's amplified instrumentation than bluegrass, which is typically acoustic instruments. Subsequent to that, country music goes through a smoothing out period. Sometimes it gets called the countrypolitan era. This is the addition of strings to the music, not heavily bowed fiddles, but a string section like the Nashville Strings. Chet Atkins has a lot to do with this. It's the urbanization of country music in the 1950s. And someone like Jim Reeves or Patsy Cline or someone like that comes along, and their beautiful mellifluous voice gets backed up by a chorus group and a big string section. And instead of hitting a rim shot on the side of your snare drum, you know, it's brush drum. So it takes on some of the sounds of urban jazz. So the tinkling piano instead of the heavily bowed fiddle and the whiny steel guitar. And so in that period, country goes through a popification, if we can use that term, which I did, so we can, in that it is really trying to appeal to people with urban sensibilities. That goes through to the mid 60s. And then there is really a reaction to that as rock comes into the popular music environment. You start to have country musicians who are not only hearing country music, but also rock, and they want their music to kind of reflect what's going on within their age group. And Nashville isn't really doing it anymore. And so that's when the scene kind of shifts to Austin, and you get the development of outlaw rock or so-called redneck rock, or however you're going to term that, which is your Willie Nelsons and Waylon Jennings and, you know, the great songwriters that come out of that era, like Guy Clark or Townes Van Zandt, or, you know, folks like that. So once you get to that point, so if you can do old time and then singing cowboys, Western swing, bluegrass, honky tonk, countrypolitan, Nashville sound, it often gets called, then outlaw country, you're up to those 7 genres. Well, what's after that? Well, anything after that is pretty much an amalgamation of those things, or is a direct descendant of one of those things. So contemporarily, the Americana music format tends to embrace those artists who might be considered a retro artist because they play the singing cowboy style, or they like Western swing, or they like the big lush Nashville sound, or they like something a little more raw in the honky tonk vein, or they go all the way back, like a Rhiannon Giddens or someone like that, who's playing 19th century mountain ballads, you know, however we want to interpret those. And then ultimately that outlaw country movement is sort of the 70s hippie version of country. Then you just kind of circle back around. You know, that's why Vince Gill is thought so highly of in so many circles, because he's such a great instrumentalist and singer as well. But he came in this kind of neo-traditional movement of the 1980s to kind of put some authenticity back into country music, trying to, give it that grit that it lost somewhere along the way. And subsequent to that, we have the explosion of pop country alongside Garth Brooks, who brings that rock sensibility with regard to showmanship into the contemporary concert era to become the biggest selling single artist in all of popular music history now. So that's essentially what you do. And you get to the current era. Here in this area, we have the Red Dirt scene. And any musician in the Red Dirt scene, John Cooper or, anybody from the Red Dirt Rangers or those other, what I now call probably third generation Red Dirt musicians, because a lot of the first generation of those musicians, Tom Skinner, Bob Childers, they're gone now. Steve Ripley, they've all sent their energy off into the universe. They left their recordings and we still have those. But if you were to talk to contemporary people, the Red Dirt sound is an amalgamation of a lot of things. It's part folk, it's part blues, it's part bluegrass, it's part country, it's part rock. It can be a lot of different things. And that's one of the things that the Red Dirt Rangers will say, oh, you need a country band? We're it. Oh, you need a blues band? Yeah, we're it. Oh, you got an elementary school? You need some kid songs? Okay, we got that. Oh, we're going to go to the Woody Guthrie Festival and play folk? Okay, got it. We're going to go, play alongside a cross-Canadian ragweed in a harder edge environment. They'll play some tougher songs. And that has always been a hallmark of Oklahoma musicians, is being able to weave in and out of styles. And if you look at the great jazz musicians who came from the state, one of the things that it's very easy to determine about them is that they were able to transcend individual genres related to periods of time. So they might start out as a swing musician, but then evolve into a bebop musician, something along those lines. And it may have something to do with the diverse makeup of Oklahoma and how musicians had to be able to appeal to a lot of different sensibilities. Bob Wills is a great example of this because he could play so many different styles. He might have a blues from his childhood of playing alongside other kids that lived in his area that were black kids that knew the blues or they heard their parents singing it or whatever, along with the fiddle songs that went along with the white side and the dances. And then he's out in New Mexico for a while and he picks up these, Hispanic or Mexican sounds. And so that's part of his music. So one of the things we've always had here in Oklahoma is this diversity that has required musicians to be able to fulfill the desire of the listeners to hear different things.
So the cultural diversity of the state is reflected in the musical diversity.
Certainly. No doubt about it.
I read some cool stuff in your book, The Oklahoma Music Guide, which we'll put a link to on our website, about how influential Bob Wills was, for example, introducing the first drums to country music and introducing lead guitar to country music, which then grew into rock and roll. That was an amazing kind of side story.
No doubt about it. I've just recently watched the Ken Burns documentary on country music.
Definitely want to ask you about that.
I have more references to that. One of the things he didn't really approach in there, and I first want to say that, I have ultimate admiration for Ken Burns and what he does, and I've watched almost every documentary that he's done. It's influenced my own video making style, and anybody who makes videos is influenced by Burns because of the way he uses photographs and just kind of how he unfolds his stories and everything. So I say that at first, and anybody who watches anything that's in their specialty area is always going to say, well, wait a minute, why didn't you say this, or why didn't you say that, or you left that out, or whatever. So I'm not anyway like parsing quality of his excellent work, because there's only so much he can do. And we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But one of the Will stories that he didn't have time to get to was that they went to Nashville to be in the Grand Ole Opry. Well, he depicted Wills at the Grand Ole Opry, but the deal was that the Grand Ole Opry didn't allow drums because that was associated with black music.
Oh, yeah.
So you couldn't take a drum set in there and play because of the racial divide in the country at that time. And one of the things Burns always focuses on is how the sociological environment influenced the musicians they're playing, the music they're playing, the crowds, how it all came together and so forth.
And we're talking 1930s era, right?
Yeah, at this point, you're up to probably the late 30s, and I can't exactly say when Wills went to the Grand Ole Opry, but when he started setting his drums up, they're like, hey, what's up with the drum set? And he's like, well, that's part of the band. And I go, well, we don't do drums at the Grand Ole Opry. And he's like, all right, boys, pack it up. We're out of here. And they're like, oh, wait a second. Okay. So they let him play, but that goes on at the Grand Ole Opry up through and past Elvis Presley. Remember, the reason rockabilly is what it is because there's a slapping bass. That's the precursor to the funk bass. It's popping it, right? So when you hear that clicking noise in rockabilly music, that's the rhythm that they wouldn't let be provided by a drum set. So it's that, that kind of thing, right? So, even, Elvis early on, he was not successful at the Grand Ole Opry when he first went there. But all that to say, Wills not only added the drums, but the electric guitar. And so one of the things Burns also did not have time to talk about really is how the electric guitar has a lot of its origins here in this region, specifically Oklahoma and Texas. And it's Wills' guitarists, Eldon Shamblin, who didn't mention this either, who it was for a long time considered the rhythm guitarist of all time on electric guitar. And the same thing that Honky Tonk needed, which was louder instruments because of the din of a loud honky tonk environment. Western
joint.
Swing really brought that along first, alongside what's happening in jazz at the time. You have to remember that as well. So there's some scholars have talked more about this, that in the 1930s, when Eldon Shamblin is really getting going as an electric guitarist with Bob Wills, Charlie Christian is already playing in Oklahoma City. Well, Christian wasn't on the radio at that time, but Wills was on the radio at that time. And so there's an inference that Christian could have heard Eldon Shamblin on the radio and, taken some of that. So that's a really interesting and dynamic time. And Wills, if you listen to some of his songs, they are definitely proto-rock or proto-rockabilly.
Yeah.
But not really proto-rockabilly because they have a drum set. That's part of it, and the electric guitar, because the Elvis trio, that was Elvis and Scotty Moore, they had the electric guitar but an acoustic bass, and ultimately they did add DJ Fontana on the drums. That was really the first great rock group. Okay, all that to say, Wills. And when you were asking me about my top list of country music artists, two or three down the line is like, well, there's probably 4 or 5 Wills songs that you just have to know because of the way they use the electric guitar or the way that they swing or the way that they add horns. And he was very revolutionary in a lot of ways. Another thing that the Burns documentary didn't have time to talk about was how Wills at one time tried to add some black horn players. And that was a no-go, right? So they went in the band and played, and there was an immediate outcry. And he's like, sorry, guys, but, you can't be in the band because of all the concerns that were at that time.
Well, let's talk about, speaking of that and definitions of country music, what is and isn't music. Right before we started this episode, you checked your mail and the new Billboard magazine was in your mailbox. Correct. And what were the top 2 songs that are on the charts right now today in October 2019? That's
really interesting and deserves a little setup. So I'll go ahead and talk about country music as a whole. I've been a disc jockey since I was 16 years old. Okay. And my second station was KMUS Radio in Muskogee, Oklahoma. So the MUS is, I'm a Muskogee High School graduate. Okay. So from that environment, and the whole Okie from Muskogee thing was very present in that period, even though it came out in 69, we're talking the late 70s here. So that whole country sensibility of Muskogee was very prominent on that particular radio station. So even then there were differences about what country music was and wasn't. So my first station was the Top 40 station in Muskogee, where I worked part-time on the weekends, and the country station offered me a, quote, full-time job where I got to go during the summer and work all day. I was on the air like from 10 in the morning till 5 and then read the 5 o'clock news.
Wow.
It was one of those things. But back then, it was all records, and 45s were all lined up in a little shelf with sleeves in it. And what they told me to do was just start here and play them all. All right. And then when you finish playing them all, start over and play them again. And behind you was a big rack of albums. And I said, what about those? They said, well, you can play one every now and then. So I'm okay. So I started looking through them. First thing I found was an Eagles album, like Desperado, that whole country rock period of the 1970s. And so I played one. Immediately, the owner comes in and goes, why are you playing that? You can't. I'm like, well, you said I could play one of those, like every now and then, and that's country. And he goes, that's not country, that's rock. And I was like, okay. I mean, you're the boss, and all right. So then I'm digging around. And I found a Jimmy Buffett album, and I was like, hey, Jimmy Buffett, Margaritaville, that's kind of country, right? And then Livingston Saturday Night has some up-tempo kind of elements to it. And he's like, I can't remember the exact lyrics, but, it's a Saturday night and I just got paid. If any luck at all, might even get laid. It's a Livingston Saturday Night. So I played it. Boom, the door opens. And I'm like, what now? You can't play that. That's not country. And I'm like, so my sensibility of country as a 16-year-old was not the same as Horace Boren, who was the owner of the station, who's a member of the Boren, family and all that. So I learned early on that there was this distinction, but I can remember as a kid, commercials for the Tulsa State Fair had Bob Wills on, Take Me Back to Tulsa, and all of that. I just remember that sensibility. But at the same time, popular music was changing in the 1970s and a lot of things were happening. I can remember the news stories about the Sex Pistols playing in Tulsa. I can remember the first DJ that brought in an Elvis Costello record to the radio station. Things were changing. And so I just wanted to set all that up because then you mentioned the program Backroads that I started on our college station that now students do. I started the same program when I was at the American Forces Network in Europe back in the 80, 81, that period. And so since I was in Europe, Europeans tend to be more open-minded about everything. And so it was okay to have a traditional artist like a Doc Watson, next to a vintage classic artist of the 60s or, like a Charlie Pride or George Jones or Hank Williams Sr. or something like that. And then play something modern like the Eagles, country rock, or, something along those lines. So when I got to New York, I went to New York University and I got involved in the radio station there. I started another program called Backroads and did the same thing. But then it was more like the country punk era was evolving. Jason and the Nashville Scorchers, Los Lobos comes out of that. Stevie Ray Vaughan, for that matter, comes out of that because he was a popular blues artist. Dwight Yoakam, before he was ever signed to an American label, was on a British label. He had to go to England to get signed because he was too traditional, too Bakersfieldy for what was considered pop country in the middle 1980s, which was, kind of milquetoast. It wasn't really that progressive. So I set all that up because then when I came back to Oklahoma, I started graduate school, and I had the original Spy, if you're familiar with KSPI. Oh, yeah. So the Spy used to be on KSPI, which is where the name The Spy came from, right? So we had a very progressive college, modern rock oriented format there. And I would slip in a John Prine record or something like that because people around here tended to be kind of okay with that. Not only that, but it was developing Red Dirt environment. So we'd have the Red Dirt Rangers there, or Bob Childers would come in, or Tom Skinner would come in, or somebody like that. So for me, being, more or less from Oklahoma and growing up in a radio environment where there's all this discussion about what is and what isn't country, we've hit a really interesting point now, and that's developed over the last 7 or 8 months. And largely it starts with the social media app TikTok, which I learned about from some college students. I teach cinema. And so the college students are like, hey, Dr. Foley, have you seen TikTok videos? I'm like, no, what's that? Oh, it's a new app. Everybody's making videos. I'm like, okay. Well, there used to be a app called Musical.ly, and then there's one called Vine. And essentially people were lip syncing to videos and making videos. Well, this company basically subsumed that. A Chinese company made TikTok and made licensed deals with artists so the music could be there, and then you as the video creator could use some copyrighted music and make your own interpretation of it. So essentially what we're all doing is making content for somebody else's app that they're making the money from. Nobody on TikTok is profiting from it unless you're driving somebody to your site or your whatever it is that that you're doing. Okay, well, the artist Lil Nas X comes out in actually, the song came out some time ago, like maybe as much as a year ago. And what they did people
Old
made
Town
a
Road.
meme to Old Town Road where they would play the beginning of it, and then at a certain point they jump up and come back down in their cowboy clothes, and they're like switch from just a kid to cowboy, and it's kind of swept the world. And so the song started to get popular, so people started to request it on country radio, and before Billboard magazine even knew what happened to them, Old Town Road sitting in the middle of the country Hot Country Song Chart, which is like the Bible chart for country songs, which is compiled of both airplay and streaming and, the attention the song is getting. So, after a week or two, whoever listened to it and said, well, that's not country. It sounds like hip hop. Plus Lil Nas X is black, number one, but he's wearing cowboy outfit, and you can kind of hear a banjo sample in there, and he's sort of putting on a little bit of a country voice. He's from the Deep South. I don't know whether it's Georgia or Alabama. He's from somewhere, in the Deep South. And so they took it off the chart and they put it on the pop chart. Excuse me. It goes to the pop chart where it goes number one and stays there for 16 weeks. It's now the biggest or longest running number one song in American popular music history. Period. Okay, so right after that, the next thing that comes along is an artist named Blanco Brown. And he merges his hip-hop stylings with his take on country music. Well, because of the way he sang and the instrumentation that he put in it, they couldn't deny it. And so it went to the top of the country charts, number one for 11 weeks. It just came off, only to be replaced by Kane Brown, another African-American country musician, with Marshmello, who's known to be like a dance guy, right? So here, sitting at the top of the Hot Country Song Chart right now is One Thing Right, Marshmello and Kane Brown, followed by The Get Up with Blanco Brown. So country music is reflecting a lot of what's happening in our society today, which is hip hop's the most popular musical form in the world, bar none, hands down. So it's natural that music's going to influence younger musicians who are coming up. And we have a history of black country music artists from the state. Stoney Edwards was a country music artist who had some success, and also Big Al Downing, who was kind of a little more rockabilly, but he played with Wanda Jackson and a lot of others. So we have had African-American musicians who have had some success in the country music field. But here in just the last 6 months, what is and what isn't country has really created a lot of interesting pop culture talk, because what people will say now is, I listen to the modern country station and it's just like hip hop beats with like some guy with the twang in his voice doing rhymes. Like, well, okay, but go back to the earliest part of folk music or country music, and what is it? There's a style, I think we call it parlando rubato or rubato. Don't quote me on that. Everybody can look it up, and don't send me any emails. It's one or the other. It ends in an O or an A. But what it means is in the manner of speech. And the manner of speech is the way that our folk music traditions evolved as how people talk. That's why Woody Guthrie's Talking Dust Bowl Blues is so country and folk at the same time. Back in 1927, had a little farm and called it heaven, so on. Because you can kind of talk and do the song. Well, what is rap? It's speech set to beats or rhythms, and clearly expressing the most primary aspects of people's lives, which is what popular music has always done. Our joys and sorrows and satires. Joys, sorrows, and satires. I've never really said it that way, but that's kind of what it is. Either you're celebrating, you're cathartically expressing your sadness, or you're making fun of somebody. and that's what a lot of it is. And country music has always done that. That's one of the best things about country music. You look like I need a drink. Song title, and it just goes like that over and over and over again. So I think that it's interesting that the terminology of what, quote, country music is developing. All kinds of people live in the country. When we say country, do we mean rural? Or do we just mean like the country, like the United States as a country, or Canada or Mexico as a country? So most people, when you say country music, you kind of know what you mean. Is it like, a white guy with a cowboy hat and an acoustic guitar singing a song about the range? Okay, well, that tends to be the stereotype. But it is really interesting now that the term is broadening to reflect the rapidly changing aspects of our society, culturally, demographically, socioculturally, psychographically, what people think and what they want to hear. So it's an interesting topic.
Yeah. So as far as the country music that has come from Oklahoma,
Sure.
What do you think kind of brands it? What is Oklahoma's brand of country music? Are there some particular sounds or lyrical concerns or other elements that mark Oklahoma country music, do you think?
Well, here's the really interesting thing that I thought watching the Ken Burns series, which is why it's interesting that documentary is kind of a recurring theme in our talk, because I watched it in preparation for this interview. But what I thought about as I was watching it, academics tend to like to group things up and try and interpret them one way or another, as I was noting all the times Oklahoma was mentioned. And that a person could really do an interesting study of the Ken Burns documentary and look at when Oklahoma is mentioned. The fact is, you can't tell the story of country music without Oklahoma. Can't. You can tell parts of it. You can talk about its origins. You can talk about a few developments, but it's not just the musicians and the music that came from here. It's the history of the state. Because when you talk about the westward migration of the fiddle, well, where was it migrating to? Places where there were opportunities for people in the South who couldn't get jobs. And that meant the oil and cattle industry of the Southern Great Plains, Oklahoma and Texas. You can't tell the history of Western swing music without talking about Tulsa, Kane's Ballroom, Oklahoma audiences that existed. A lot of Will's band members were Oklahomans, some of the most significant ones. You can't tell the story of honky tonk music without discussing the beer joints of Oklahoma and Texas. As a matter of fact, and I'd have to dig for wherever I found this and documented it, but one of the very first places honky tonk music is ever mentioned in any kind of newspaper is in Oklahoma. It's in southern Oklahoma. Southwestern Oklahoma specifically, distinguishing it from southeastern Oklahoma, which is a little more mountainy and hillbilly-esque and more connected to the South, which is why they call it Little Dixie, as opposed to southwestern Oklahoma, meaning that quadrant that's west of I-35 and south of I-40, which has some plains aspects to it, cattle ranching and, that sort of thing. A little more cowboyish, along with the American Indian element that is there as well. So all that to say, you can't do honky tonk without that. In addition to that, when you tell Hank Williams Sr.'s story, his first recordings ever in Nashville, his backing band were Oklahomans, the Willis Brothers. They're from Shelter. They were a known country music combo, and they had a regular recording gig, and Hank Williams Sr. got his recording gig for that afternoon. And the way the story goes, as I kind of barely understand it, is they're like, well, we got a guy coming in today. I want you to back him up. And so the first 4 recordings that he did for sure have those guys on it, the Willis Brothers. And you get into pop country, not so much the Nashville sound of the 50s, but you can't tell the story of popular country without talking about Patti Page. Because Patti Page had the hit with Tennessee Waltz, which was a huge hit. It was #1 country. It was #1 pop. It was even #1 R&B. Everybody loved that song. And she wasn't really considered a country artist, but the song she did was a waltz, and it was the Tennessee Waltz. Subsequent, and that's like the most lush kind of recording that you can hear that I don't even know how you call it country, other than it's a waltz and it has Tennessee as part of its title. In addition to that, when you talk about Roger Miller from the mid-1960s, his music also king of the road, pop, country, R&B. So you've got all those different elements that are part of his sound. Subsequent to that, when you get into outlaw country, you can't tell the story of outlaw country without bringing up the song which should be on the list, Up Against the Wall, Redneck Mothers. Right? That's Ray Wiley Hubbard, right? Jerry Jeff Walker. I think they kind of combined on that. I think it was a Ray Wiley Hubbard song that Jerry Jeff Walker did. Might be, there's so much to remember, and I try and put it all together. But that's outlaw country in a nutshell. And then, with regard to the resurgence of country and the popularization of it, you can't tell that story without Garth Brooks. And we have all these current pop artists now, pop country artists, who we all know by our first names in Oklahoma. Their first names: Reba, Garth, Vince, Carrie, Ronnie, if you know Ronnie Dunn. You can't get away from that. Toby, obviously, and Toby's a really interesting story, and you can talk about him a little bit more, but all I'm trying to get at there is you can't tell the story of country music without Oklahoma. And it goes to the poverty that existed in the state, the making music for yourself, the concept that a lot of people went to church where they kind of learned to sing, or even if they didn't learn to sing, they got comfortable with singing or playing an instrument. And then there was just a lot of music around, and you had to make it if you wanted it, more or less. So, and then not only that, but there are venues for people to play in. So the combination of poverty and making music for fun, and then the business of being able to make some money by playing for people who wanted to uplift their spirits, especially in the 1930s, then you get an environment that produces a lot of music, and specifically country music.
There's a part of your book I thought was really interesting about something that fans require in order to connect with country music. The listeners need to be able to identify with the experiences of the characters in the songs. I think you're talking about Reba McEntire specifically in that part of your book. Is that something that's kind of unique to country music that helps define what makes it important?
You know, it really goes to the core of popular music. Now, what a lot of people will say is country music is that plain spoken delivery that I mentioned a little while ago, which is relatable. And the stories that you hear are the country concept that's brought up, the 3 chords and a truth. All right. So you just need 3 simple chords, and then experiences. I think it's Loretta Lynn who talks about that in the country music series, where the songs of country music relate to people's everyday life, and how sometimes, as popular music does, reflects changing social values. So, Ken Burns spends a good amount of time talking about women artists and how their songs started to change the way that women could feel about themselves. You know, don't come home drinking with loving on your mind, that kind of thing, where, you know, the idea is that the woman who's at home just like waiting for her man to come back from the honky tonk, and he comes back drunk and wants some kind of amorous connection, and the woman finally is like, hey, don't want it, you know, don't come home like that. So it's country music that talks about those things, and I think makes people relate to them, but it's not a lot different than any other popular music. You know, why is hip hop so popular? Well, it can just be the old American Bandstand thing, which is like, oh, well, it's got a good beat and I can dance to it. Well, that's not only it. It's also the words and the lyrics that people can relate to. Same with the blues. That, you know, the blues is a very heartfelt music that's not meant to make you feel worse. You're supposed to feel better because it's cathartic. It's like that concept of the good cry, right? And so within country, you definitely have the concept of the good cry, and as well as the good celebration and the poking fun, you know, at people. But that's really it. And I think when you listen to Hank Williams Sr., you hear that plain spoken delivery that can send us right to Toby Keith, you know, because there's been in the last, I don't know, 5 or 8 years, this whole concept of bro country, right? Where it's the guys with the baseball caps and sitting on the unfolded tailgate of the truck, and they're drinking beer, and the girls are around, and, you know, we're having a good time. It's bro country. Well, Toby Keith flipped that around. He has his current single called That's Country, Bro. Right? And he mentions and he name checks all these different artists that really add up to country for him. And this is kind of a return to his, I Should Have Been a Cowboy song that was really popular, you know, 20 plus years ago. One of his entries into country music, where he more name checked all the cowboys, you know, kind of thing. But his delivery is very almost talking. It's definitely connected to Woody Guthrie because of the way in which he delivers his lyrics. And he can sing, he has the baritone and all that. But if you analyze his music, and I've watched him play, it's often those same 3 chords that he uses all the time, and he just changes up the subject matter. And so, you know, at its core, country music, those 3 chords, and I'm not going to over demonstrate here or anything because I'm not really the one to be doing this. But for instance, you know, everybody can go, and when I watch the country music documentary, I pay real close attention to all the artists and like how they're playing the guitar and what they're doing. Well, it's always really, really simple. It often starts with the C, and you play your song, and then you go to the F, you go back to the C, and then you go to the G. If you can play C, F, and G, you can play a million country songs, along with about every cowboy song that ever existed. Secondarily to that, if you want to mix it up, you play G, and then you play C, and then you play D, and then back to G. And you can do every Woody Guthrie song.
Huh.
C, D, back to G. And that goes all the way around. It's what we call the 1-4-5s. It's the first degree of the scale, C, the fourth degree of the scale, F, and then the fifth is G, fifth degree of the scale. Well, once you learn that, C, F, G, G, C, D, in the blues, EAB or EAB7, you've got 1,000 songs that you can play. And, you know, Woody Guthrie says something like, well, if you use more than 3 chords, you're just showing off. Well, there are people who are really, really good. And those of us who just are what we call cowboy chorders, that's pretty much what I am, right? It's like I can play some basic chords and have fun with the guys that I play with and make up some songs and entertain us and a few people who kind of can put up with what we do. But once you have that, you really kind of understand the power of country music, that it's not complicated music. Folk music, by definition, is unlettered. It's uneducated. You don't learn it in the academy. You learn it from your parents, your grandparents, your uncle, a friend. Somebody shows you a few chords. Next thing you know, you're, playing a chord. You're like, okay, well, that's an E. Everybody likes a big old E chord. Well, now you're somewhere because you can play the one chord and kind of work with it. Anyway, all that to say that that's really that country music power. And here in Oklahoma, we had to make our music for so long that I think that it just kind of mushroomed once the rock era hit. Once Elvis and his band sent things going, Chuck Berry, all that, and then the Beatles come along, and then everything really takes off. The Ken Burns series makes a point to indicate how much country music influenced the Beatles, right? Because they knew about it and everything.
Yeah, so I'm not from Oklahoma. When I moved here about 20 years ago, and I remember one of the very first things I saw was a poster showing the names of all the country music stars who came from Oklahoma, and it was striking. I'm not a huge country music fan, but I recognized all those names. And I know, like, Country Music Television did a 40 Greatest Men of Country Music episode. 10 of those guys are from Oklahoma.
Yeah.
25% of the most important guys in country music are from Oklahoma. Why are there so many country music stars from Oklahoma?
Well, there's a couple things about that. One, I think it's what I mentioned earlier, which is poverty, making music for yourself, having that influence from the church. But, people being people, there were plenty of celebratory places to go play in beer joints or at fairs or that kind of thing. So the environment fostered the production of music. We do have a musical state still yet today where a lot of band programs have fallen away. I call high school football games on Friday night for Kush and the KUSH radio. Wherever you go, there's a band. Everywhere. And if you go to some of the smallest 8-man schools in the state, you're going to see 14 kids in T-shirts out there in some kind of band. So there's been this musical sensibility. Now, some schools have had to let their band programs go because it is expensive to keep them going and everything like that. But I think that our state has always had a musical sensibility, and it derives from that time of having to make music for yourself. And for a long time, Oklahoma was kind of isolated, from everywhere else, and yet influenced by everywhere else. As some people have said, a cultural crossroads in a lot of ways. But we also have to keep in mind the mythos of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma myth, and what it represents in the pop culture and national mindset. So you also had people saying they were from Oklahoma when they weren't. A good example is Cowboy Copas, who was killed in the same plane crash that killed Patsy Cline. He's from Ohio. But all his material, all his press said he was from Muskogee, Oklahoma, and he wasn't. Why? Because that gave him more credibility, more authenticity. Even though Eddie Cochran did spend some summers and visits with his parents in Oklahoma City, I mean, it's a real fudge saying he's from Oklahoma City. His parents would come from Minnesota, and they go to California. He'd drive through, stay with the grandparents. He was here a little bit, here and there. And but in his press subsequent to that, he was from Oklahoma. That's what people wanted because it sounded better to be from Oklahoma than Minnesota. And so Oklahoma's always had this kind of myth in the national mindset, which was even furthered by the musical Oklahoma. So when that came out, it just implanted in everybody's mind what this place is about, even if Rodgers and Hammerstein never been to Oklahoma, right? They made that up completely just on their own mindset of what they thought Oklahoma was, based it on a play by an Oklahoma playwright, Lynn Riggs, from Claremore. But the Hawks and the lazy circles in the sky and Brand New State and all of that, you know, it doesn't discuss any of the political or economic or historical realities of American Indians or African Americans and their experience here in the state. It's very, you know, again, to use the word milquetoast, you know, but was meant to be entertainment for the time, and became something that was bigger than representing just Oklahoma, because it kind of was a post-war hopefulness that came out of that. And what really made Oklahoma big was when they started staging it in England. Oh. And, you know, post-war England was so desultory that Oklahoma provided this sort of positive inspiration for a whole new way of thinking. So, anyway, that's some about that. But why has Oklahoma produced so many country musicians? I think it's just the reasons that we stated. It goes along with the sociocultural history of the state, musical opportunities and availabilities, and people liking to hear live music.
And a lot of venues where they can
venues to play. Yeah.
You wrote something interesting about venues too, about how, and kind of illustrates how Oklahoma is at a crossroads geographically too. Going back all the way hundreds of years ago with the Spiro Mounds, we were this geographic area was a crossroads, and railroads came through here. Route 66 came through here.
Right. Well, and a lot of times, you know, Oklahoma is considered a travel state for musicians.
So this is why we have weekday concerts.
Correct.
Right?
That's exactly right. Exactly. Because you can get a bigger gig in Dallas or Houston or Nashville or Memphis or St. Louis or Denver than you can in Tulsa or even Oklahoma City. But even for years, Oklahoma was considered a travel state because they're going from Kansas City to Dallas, or they're going from Albuquerque to, you know, Little Rock or whatever, you know, and so people just travel through it all the time. For many years, whenever I talk to somebody, I tell them from Oklahoma, they'd say, "Oh yeah, I went through there one time." I'm like, "Oh yeah, well, stop? No, you're just driving through." And so that's what a lot of people do, is drive through. However, that's like and that's a different subject matter. But in the jazz days, Oklahoma was a breeding ground for jazz musicians, and touring groups knew they could come here and pick guys up, and especially Muskogee. That's a whole other history of that area. Because of the music that existed here. One of the unique things about Oklahoma's African-American history specifically is the music programs that existed in some of the black schools. And some of the musicians that came out of that environment, very significant. Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Muskogee, and so forth. So, but that's, you know, kind of a different track.
I have to do a whole other episode on that. That'd be awesome.
That's an interesting one too, the jazz one.
But the weeknight concerts deal explains my lack of work productivity on many Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
Yeah, Monday night at the BOK Center.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So we talked a lot about the Ken Burns series. I'm really curious what you thought about it, if there were any glaring omissions or any misrepresentations in that series, if a lot of people have probably watched it.
The thing I would say again about Ken Burns, I admire him tremendously for all the work that he's done. And I understand the challenge of putting something together like that, of having so many hours of videos and tens of thousands of photographs, and you're trying to tell this story. And so I thought that, you know, like I said earlier, just about everybody who has a specialty area, when somebody's talking about their area, you're like, oh, wait a minute, you know, why didn't you talk about this or that? And the things I liked is how they talked about the Okies and how the Okies got to California, and that shaped a lot of the sentimentality of the sentiments of people who were there. And so Merle Haggard's parents were there, and you know, Dwight Yoakam in the Ken Burns thing describes Buck Owens as having this like tough Okie demeanor and all of that. So I thought that was good. And even when he brought up Woody Guthrie, I thought he did a pretty good job on that, talking about how Guthrie really should have been considered a country artist.
Yeah.
So, for example, Marty Stewart says, and I noted this, that Woody Guthrie was one of the purest country artists God ever made. But politics got in the way of country music's establishment accepting him because he was a folk artist, and folk music started to become associated with New York City and Greenwich Village and progressivism and liberalism and, oh my gosh, socialism and communism and so forth. So once that happened, it was like Woody Guthrie and folk, that's out. But Woody Guthrie is 3 chords, and a lot of the songs are just old English, Irish, Scottish ballad melodies that he put contemporary lyrics to that reflected the experience that he was either having or witnessing.
And tunes that he stole from the Carter family.
Yeah, well, right.
Family,
well, back then you always took melodies from everybody else, and so the thing that the Ken Burns film did well, I thought, was, from Oklahoman's sensibility, is talked about the classism, I guess you could say, that Oklahomans and other people who were just considered Okies when they got to California, no matter where they're from. And I think that that's one of Burns's themes throughout his documentaries is the way in which race plays into the creation of art or history. And I mean, the first major one, I think, was Civil War. It's all about that. And then when he gets into how the West was lost, it's all about the Native American experience, and so he's always been big on that. As far as like what he could include, yeah, it's tricky, I think. And, I wouldn't want to second guess him. It's, to me, just fascinating to watch the documentaries. And I was glad to hear the things that I heard. Again, as an academic, I'd go through all the episodes and note all the places Oklahoma was mentioned and try and gain some knowledge out of that. Some places it wasn't mentioned where it could have been. But then, I can't have, all my birthday cake, as long as I get a little piece of it, I'm okay with it. Just from a personal point of view, I think that.
So this is an unfair sort of big summing up question, but what do you think are some of the key things that country music ultimately tells us about Oklahoma's culture and our history and our values and America's, really?
Well, I think that if you follow the timeline and you look at the way in which, fiddles came to this area and why, and then the earliest cowboy songs that are not part of the singing cowboy era, but are really those Anglo-Celtic ballads of the late 1800s that tell the real story of what was going on the cattle trails and among the cattle and, the whole cattle environment. You can learn a lot about the history of that time through that music, and you just keep going. The music that, one of the things I think Burns didn't do, because he didn't really go this direction, he talked about Gene Autry and how significant Gene Autry was. However, and the rising popularity of it, but he didn't really talk about these same Okies who were in California, who were considered like the lowest of the low on the socioeconomic ladder. And so the stories go that if you were a little kid in a school in California and you had kind of a country Oklahoma accent type thing, the teacher would constantly correct you, like, don't talk like that, that sort of thing. Well, the cowboy image was much more kind of sparkly and fantasy oriented than the Dust Bowl, Woody Guthrie, talking Dust Bowl blues, migrant worker image. That was the Woody Guthrie image, is what they all look like. That wasn't what they wanted to think of themselves as on Friday and Saturday night. So as Gene Autry started to become popular and the singing cowboy thing started to become popular, that was an opportunity for Okies in California to dress up and bring out a little bit of what maybe they left behind. But again, that's that popular mythos of Oklahoma and the West and cowboys and all that kind of thing. So that's really what created a groundswell for the popularity of the singing cowboy movement, especially in California, was Okies wanting to dress up nicer on the weekends. And for them, dressing up nicer was putting on cowboy clothes and a hat. And that all contributed to the rise of that particular music. So I think, again, you can just look at each decade and what music came out of that decade and then figure out kind of what was going on, in the state at the time. For example, I knew Western swing musicians who are no longer alive who did not like, quote, hillbilly music, mountain music, bluegrass music. They felt that was too simple. Western swing musicians consider themselves jazz musicians.
I've heard it called Okie jazz, right?
Definitely called, well, derisively in Nashville.
From Nashville.
But from the Oklahoman point of view, those guys were great players, and they thought of themselves as part of a big swing band. And they could really play their instruments. It wasn't just the so-called 1-4-5s that I talked about earlier, the cowboy chords or the bluegrass chords or the basic country chords. They would be jazz chords, so-called jazz chords, which there's, it's just a way of adding coloration to a chord. That if you do in country, it's like, why are you doing that? Or if you're a blues guy, you're like, I remember DC Minner used to tell, I heard him tell a guy, don't be playing jazz chords at my blues festival, right? Like, keep it blues, right? This is a blues festival. So that whole idea of learning about history and values really goes along with looking at what was happening musically along with what was happening historically at a particular era. Because popular music can teach us a lot. You know, even if you think about Elvis Presley's first single, just bring this up quickly. What's one side is That's All Right Mama, okay, which was by Arthur Crudup, black artist, right? Other side, it just was on my head now. It's the Bill Monroe tune.
Blue Moon?
No, it's like That's All Right Mama's on one side, and it's not Blue Moon. It's a Bill Monroe song, and maybe it is Blue Moon.
Blue Moon in Kentucky.
Yeah, maybe that's on the B side. Okay, so here you have Elvis Presley, 1954, song by a black artist on one side, song by a white artist on the other side. Well, it went out to radio stations. Black radio stations thought he was black because of one side. White stations thought he was white because of the other side, right? What's also going on at the time, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, separate but equal is unconstitutional. Here's Elvis Presley putting them both together.
Same year. Right?
You know? And so, you know, if you study all that and you look at the dynamics of it, you can learn a lot from popular music. Muddy Waters. I encourage everybody to go to Manish Boy, because what does that song say? Right? He's like, I'm a man, M-A-N, no boy, B-O-Y. So he's making a political statement there, socio-cultural statement. But if you don't understand the roots of that and where that comes from, you know, we all as adults since the 60s at least have said, hey, man, how's it going? Well, you know, where does that come from? Specifically from African-American men calling each other man instead of what they had to be subjected to, which was being called boy, no matter whether they were 4 or 94. And so, you know, these things, culture is all wrapped up in popular music, and even the Old Town Road Story teaches us a lot about what's going on right now.
Yeah. And
so with regard to Oklahoma, I just think that take the musicians who came from here at a given time, listen to the music they produced, and then study the historical era in which they were producing that music, and you'll learn deeper things about that particular time.
Are there interesting things happening right now in Oklahoma country music that tell us something about what's going on in the state now?
Here's what I would say about what we have going on right now is a lot of these young musicians, you know, and like a Kalen Faye, John Fulbright, Caitlin Butts, Carter Sampson, Paul Benjamin, you know, these musicians they're really good contemporary singer-songwriters, and it sounds a little bit folky, a little bit rock, but they can go into that gospel range. So to me, the guy is Mike Hosty.
Oh.
He's the guy.
I saw his LP around the corner.
Yeah, I believe in Mike Hosty, and here's why. Number one, he is a hard-working performer who does it on his own. He's a one-man band now. He's played with people over the years, but he's a one-man band now. But if you go to a Mike Hosty show, you can either call out for or just wait for any musical style, and you're going to hear it, because he's so steeped in all musical traditions. He can do country or blues or rock or, you know, a Hispanic sounding song, mariachi song. I mean, he can do all, and then he can like slow it down to this smooth groove and like sing like Al Green. I mean, not exactly like Al Green, but you know, he can achieve that tone and mood. And so when you go see a Hosty show, you see an Oklahoma show. He does the Frady Hole song where he talks about the weather reporters. And how, you know, there might be a storm 2 days away, but they've got an alert going on right now, you know, and like telling you why you need to take cover today, even though it's not even going to show up for 2 days. And then when they get here, it's like pandemonium, you know, and he just does these hilarious things about Oklahoma, and he can list a whole, like not all 77 counties, but he can almost name them all. And, or when he goes to new towns, he always makes notes of these things, and he's been around so much, he has all these cultural references from all over the state. And so, while you wouldn't call him a country artist, you call him an Oklahoma artist. My friend John Cooper from the Red Dirt Rangers says Mike Hosty is a genre of one.
Wow.
Because he can do it all. And he's entertaining, and he's funny, he's hardworking, he's self-effacing. He's aware of his talents, and yet at the same time, he's not overbearing about them. He just goes to the next gig, the next gig, the next gig, the next gig. And when you go, people are there who've seen him and like him, and they know his songs, and they're ready for whatever. And if he says, okay, what do you want to hear? 5 different people will say something different. What I would say is go listen, you know, his song, Streets Paved with Gold, which is right up the Woody Guthrie Talking Blues.
Oh, okay.
He can do that. And it's a hilarious song about we've been told the streets of, or the heaven streets are paved with gold, and his whole meditation on what we learn as kids and what potentially is really true once we get our rational minds about us as time goes on. So we can mention, Parker Millsap, someone like him. These guys who are having success, Jared Deck, that are from Oklahoma, they're young people. And that goes outside of Carrie Underwood and Garth Brooks and Vince Gill and Reba McEntire and Toby Keith and, all these names that we know, Ronnie Dunn. These are like the young people in their 20s and early 30s and, that are the musical entertainers that are here today. And so if you haven't seen John Fulbright, you don't understand contemporary Oklahoma music because he's it, he's a great player. He's a great songwriter. He can sing, and he's hooked up with these other good musicians in Tulsa now, Paul Benjamin, Scott Aycock. It's called the Tulsa Review. So there's all that, that's going on. And we have kind of maybe some of our own sounds, the so-called Tulsa sound, the J.J. Cale, Leon Russell, that whole evolution, which is kind of a blues-based, country blues-based thing, the Western swing that comes from here. All of that. But as far as what's happening today, I think that you do two things. You go to where people are dancing and you listen to the songs they're listening to. And essentially you'll find this is the same music everybody else is dancing to around the country. But what's interesting here is because we've had so much side-by-side activity that you're going to see people two-step in a circle around the dance floor to a George Strait song. And then the next thing that comes on is hip-hop, Blanco Brown or Get Up or whoever, and now everybody's out on the floor line dancing in unison. That song's over, now everybody's two-stepping again. We seem, because of our development, to maybe not be so hung up on racial divides, and that's a tricky one because of all the unpacking that you have to do there. But the way our state came together, it was supposed to be Indian country. It was supposed to be Indian territory forever. Nobody else. Okay, well, that didn't work. So then, after the Civil War, people start flooding in here. People of African descent from the South, who, by the way, the blacks who were already here, the freedmens, were not too thrilled with all these people coming from the South because they weren't educated. Blacks in Indian Territory, Oklahoma Territory tended to be educated. And so immediately you had a black class division between the ones who were already here and the ones who were coming from the South, even though they were recruited from the South to form the all-black town movement of Oklahoma in the latter part of the 19th century. So you got that going on. And then you have people of Anglo-European descent coming from every angle. They're coming from, Oklahoma is such a crossroads place. So that created this kind of cultural stew in what is a young state in which people could hear each other and borrow from one another. Let's remember that the, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, the first time it was ever documented as having been sung was in southeastern Oklahoma.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Wallace. They were slaves, and they were singing it like the Choctaw Academy or something. Huh. Someone heard it. They wrote down the lyrics and the melody, took it back to Fisk University, where it then became a national hit and, representative of that whole thing. As I've done in my other work, the Muskogee Creek hymns that evolved out of Scottish missionaries who took on slaves of African descent, who then put slave spiritual melodies to Scottish hymns, which then were converted in the Muskogee Creek language. And so now you got a tricultural musical product. It's Scottish, it's of African descent, and it's Native American. So you can't find me another cultural product. And I've challenged a lot of people at some pretty high levels. Tell me the first multicultural product that embraced the three major cultures that go on to make up what is the United States pre-Hispanic and Asian influence. Listen to those Muskogee Creek hymns and you'll hear them. And this is well told in the film This May Be the Last Time, done by Sterling Harjo. Oh. So what you do is, and I'll do the real quick version because I know we're about to run out of time here, but this just speaks to Oklahoma and its musical traditions. So there's, This May Be the Last Time. This could be the last time, we don't know. All right? That's the way the song goes. Well, there was a Creek hymn in the 19th century. It went, Ispogides o Meskifliskos. Same melody, means the same thing. This may be the last time, we don't know. We don't know how far the lyrics go back to that because we know that sensibility existed from people being ripped apart from their homelands in Africa and being put here, or they may finally get a family here and then they're split up again because of the slave trade. In addition to that, we have Native Americans who are in one home, taken from that home, put on these arduous removals where they may never see each other again. So the experience of people in the slave trade and people of Native American descent who are ripped away from their homes and families and moved is not dissimilar. So here you have a song that represents all that. The Staple Singers have a hit with it in the 1950s. This could be the last time. And then
the Stones
in the 60s. So if you know what you're doing, you can draw a timeline from Muskogee Creek hymns of the early 19th century right to the Rolling Stones.
Wow.
And that is part of the Oklahoma music story. Now, we did tell that story. I'm repeating it in the film. This may be the last time. Directed by Sterling Harjo. So I'd recommend people check that out.
Awesome.
Because when we talk about country music, you're talking about American roots music. And that gets to this thing of Americana. Like, what is Americana? As I mentioned earlier, it's all these American roots music forms that are still present in our country today. African American gospel, Anglo-American gospel, which typically gets called Southern gospel, and then blues and Dixieland jazz and all these subgenres of country that I've mentioned, and then just contemporary singer-songwriters. So when we talk about country music, essentially we're talking about that music that is of the people and for the people, to use the cliche, but specifically it comes from the British Isles and then is influenced by the American cultural milieu of the South, and then the diffusion of the people west, all the way to California. And that's how we get to where we are today with Marshmello and Kane Brown, number 1 on the Hot Country Song Chart, with number 2 after 11 weeks, Blanco Brown's The Get Up, which came from TikTok. So, the country's evolving, society evolves, and popular music is always an interesting lens through which to look at that society and learn about it.
Well, we'll put some information about that documentary on our webpage for this episode.
Good.
That sounds really fascinating. And thank you so much, Dr. Foley. I can't thank you enough for being on this episode.
You're welcome.
I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
You're totally welcome. And I would just, I've got my Oklahoma music guide. If anybody wants to track it down,
yeah, we'll put information about that.
Amazon or New Forms Press.
Did you want to mention another organization that you're involved with?
I'll talk briefly, just as far as being able to plug something here or there. We have the Oklahoma Music Guide. Of course, there's our radio station, KUSH out of Cushing, and you can listen online. I would also say an organization called Bugles Across America. Excuse me, and I'm passionate about this organization because what it is provides live taps played on a bugle for Veterans Memorial Services or Veterans Day Services. And some years ago, the federal government said any veteran could have a flag ceremony with a color guard and taps. Problem is, there aren't enough people who can play taps. So Bugles Across America was formed as a volunteer organization where we will go out and play taps for funerals, memorial services, that kind of thing. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a veteran and also can play a horn a little bit still. I learned how to play in junior high, but I still like it. And so for absolutely free, we get a notice in our email that says, hey, there's a mission at such and such church or cemetery, and if you can make it, please respond to this email. And then what you're supposed to do is show up and either in uniform or not. I still have my old Army uniform, and you can wear it on certain occasions like this. So I had to have the buttons moved over a little bit, but I can still get it, get it on. So you go out and you play taps. It's usually a really emotional thing, for everybody, and you feel good about it because you've kind of provided this live music. And where I really got the idea was a Western swing musician. This will bring us all the way around. Don Toll was his name. He's from Cushing at the end of his life. Played with Johnny Lee Wills and Bob Wills. Recorded with Johnny Lee. Played with Bob a little bit. Excellent guitarist. I learned a lot about what I know about Western swing from him. And so I went to his funeral over in Cushing. And the color guard came out and they played this digital horn, or it's an inserted speaker that goes in a horn, and somebody holds it up very formally. I don't have anything bad to say about the guys and girls who do, or men and women who do this, but it sounds sort of cheesy because it's a digital speaker and it goes, meh, 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 meh. Not only that, but in bad weather, it can malfunction. And that is the worst thing that can happen at a Veterans Memorial Service, is for the thing to malfunction. Well, it didn't malfunction, but it sounded bad at Don's funeral. I was like, here's this great Western swing musician and guitarist, and he's got a fake bugle playing taps because he was a Korean War vet. I was like, there's got to be, and I looked it up online. Sure enough, there it is, just sitting there. Bugles Across America. And we do just what I said we do, which is go out and play the 22, 3 or 4 notes, depending on how you play it, of taps at Veteran Services for free. And anyone can make a request of that organization. And there are various guys around the state who do it. You don't even have to be a veteran or anything. As long as you can play it, that's all that matters. But it's a great organization. I always try and promote them a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We'll put some information about Bugles Across America on our webpage too.
Certainly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foley.
Very welcome.
All right.
Chris, your sidekick Richard here. Glad to have you here in the Rock House. And
we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the BrainBox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/BrainBox website, and on social media by using hashtag BrainBoxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon. This program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. So this has been BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin.